All right, so we are almost ready to fetch the news articles from newsapi.ai. Before we can do that, we actually need to create an article model so we have a place to store the articles. So one thing I want to show here is this so-called base table pattern that the claude.md file already mentioned. So basically, for most of our models, we will define a so-called base model and a table model that extends the base model. The base model includes all the core fields that we care about. And that's the model that Pydantic AI, our AI framework, is going to deal with. And by extension, the LLM, so Gemini, for example. So all the fields that the agent essentially cares about will be in the base model. And then the table model extends the base model. So for example, for the article, that's the actual URL of the article, the source, the title, the body, the published ad date. And then we also have the news service and the news service article key. We're using these just so we can reserve the flexibility to swap out the news service in the future. So news service in our case will be something like newsapi.ai, and news service article key is, in their case, it's the URI that they return in the API, but a different news provider might call it ID or key or something else. So this gives us kind of a nice way to uniquely refer to a particular article. So that's in the article base, and that's what the AI agent logic uses. And then we have a article class that inherits from article base. And this mainly adds the fields that the database cares about. So the ID field, the created ad field, and the run ID, which allows us to link it back to a run, like I mentioned earlier. So the database uses the article. I hope this makes sense. This will become more obvious later once we add some more models and do the actual first agentic steps. So back to the README. Here is the prompt that you can copy and paste. And we'll have a couple more of those. In this case, we could reuse the same chat, but we don't really need all of this context. I think I'm going to start with a fresh chat, make it a little bit easier for Claude Code. If you run a whole bunch of things in a single chat, eventually the context will end up being full and it'll go through a compaction phase where it kind of internally summarizes everything. And that takes a while and is also not super efficient in terms of token use. So rule of thumb, whenever you're doing something that doesn't immediately depend on the previous context, just start a fresh conversation. So we'll do that here. I'm going to paste this prompt. And then let's take another look at what we're asking for here. So we're asking to add the article model following the base table pattern that we just went over. We're explaining why. So we're saying since article will later interact with AI agents. Probably not super critical here, but in general, whenever you're dealing with an LLM, it's kind of helpful when you're asking for something to explain why you're asking for it. That really helps with the reasoning and helps it make the right trade-offs. And then very similar to what we did with the run model earlier, we described the fields that we need. We just looked at those, right? So for article base, we have these fields, article adds, ID, run ID. Also adds a unique constraint on news service and news service article key. So we can prevent duplicates. We add the article repository with these methods. Specifically, we're asking for upsert many. So with articles, we want to make sure that we only store unique articles. So say we run the pipeline twice in a row, chances are it'll fetch the same articles again from the news service. We don't want to end up with a whole bunch of duplicates in the database. So we'll perform a upsert. So we'll try to look up the article based on the combination of the news service and news service article key. If it finds it, great. If not, that's when we actually create a new article in the database. And we'll accomplish that with this onConflict do nothing. So then we have tests for the upsert many function, including verifying duplicate handling, and an alembic migration. That's it. So we'll kick this off. All right, there it finished. So once again, we get a nice summary. So it created the models, the repository, and the tests, and the migration. We could click on these things here, or I usually like to use this view actually, which shows me the diffs from my last commit. So let's look at the migration first. This looks pretty familiar, right? So we create the articles table with all the fields. Here in the existing models class, where we already had the run, we now also have the article base and the article that adds the ID and so on. And it actually did a pretty good job and added descriptions here. So that's actually perfect. Sometimes it doesn't do that, and then I've had to prompt it to do that. But I think our Claude.md actually specifically asks for descriptions, since that's something that I ran into in the past. So this looks solid. Repositories is pretty straightforward. We just have the upsert many function that we asked for. Here we see the onConflict do nothing. And we get another test. So here we go. All right, sort of a helper function to make an article. And then the actual repository tests. So this looks solid. Let's run our tests again. Okay, everything still looks good. So we'll commit our changes to Git. Added article model, that's good enough. Keep it brief. Okay, back to the README where we have the next prompt. So again, I'll just copy this in here. Later, you'll be on your own. You're going to have to type in your own prompts. We'll actually do some exercises as well, where I may ask you to try to take a stab at drafting the prompt based on the outcome that we want. But for now, until we get to the fetch step, we'll do this together. Let's actually start a fresh chat again. We'll paste the prompt. This one's a little bit shorter. So we're now asking it to implement the fetch pipeline step. And, the ClaudeMD describes the overall structure and the different steps. So it already has some context on this. So we're asking it to create a PipelineStep base class that defines the pattern for all steps, loading inputs, processing, persisting to database, and printing stats. Then implement fetchStep to retrieve articles from our newsapi.ai topic page and store them using the article model. We also need a settings class in core settings.py, extends Pydantic base settings for configuration with a module level settings instance that other files can import directly. Add newsapi API key and newsapi topic URI settings. So this is interesting. It actually kind of jumped the gun earlier, and if you remember, and created that settings class for us. We hadn't specifically asked for it back then. It just inferred that we will need this. It chose to add a setting for the database file and added some of the settings while it was added. So actually, we could probably just get rid of this paragraph. I'm actually going to change it to instruct it to read these settings from the existing settings class, just to be explicit. All right, so again, might not be needed, but doesn't hurt to be explicit here. So we'll tell it to read the settings from this file. And then the command line interface's run command should create a new run, execute the fetch step, and update the run status when done. Okay, and then reference ClaudeMD for conventions, just throwing that in for good measure. Let's do this actually. So far, I've had it automatically make the changes. Now that we're building our first proper pipeline step, let's click on this until it shows plan mode, and then hit enter here, or rather click on this. So now, instead of proceeding straight to the implementation, it should figure out what to do and then present us with a plan, and then we can either accept the plan or we can iterate some more on it until we're happy. That's generally a good strategy, especially when your prompt isn't as prescriptive as the ones that we've been using. But if you just ask it to do something, it's usually a good idea to stay in plan mode and review the plan. All right, there's our plan. So let's scroll up and take a look. Okay, plan implements PipelineStep base class and fetch step. There's some context. So the pipeline scaffolding exists, empty files, along with models, repositories, database layer, and CLI skeleton. We need to create the PipelineStep base class that defines the pattern for all steps. Implement fetch step to fetch articles from newsapi.ai and wire it into the CLI's run command. Files to modify. This all makes sense. So we're adding our step implementations in here. We have the CLI. We need to add the event registry dependency to PyProject.toml. Event registry, again, that's kind of synonymous with newsapi.ai. And this is the name of their SDK that we're going to be using. So here, and it does this the correct way through UV, right? So UV add event registry. That's how you add a new dependency, a new named dependency. So it figured all of that out. Here's the base PipelineStep class. So all of our steps will extend this. This all looks good to me. So we have the key, we have the run that it's associated with. We're loading some inputs from the database. Usually in this very first one, we won't have anything to load yet. We're doing some processing, we're persisting the results, and then printing some stats just for diagnostics. So that all looks solid to me as well. Now we see the concrete step, the fetch step. Ah yeah, here we go. Load inputs, no database inputs needed for fetch, returns none. Perfect. Process, we're using the event registry API with these settings. All right, this mostly looks good. Actually, this doesn't look quite right to me though. So it's proposing to use event registry.eventRegistry with this setting and query articles iter. And I don't think that's the function we want. We actually wanted to use the topic page. So just to make sure, I'm going to point it in that direction. So I'll click on no, keep planning. All right, so here's what I did. Since I happen to know what is actually the correct API to use here, I've built this a couple of times. I went to the event registry SDK on GitHub and found this example here. So here's some Python examples, and this is the code we want to use, right? So it should be using topic page and then load topic page from ER, passing in the URI, and then iterate over the articles. So that's the API we want. I have copied this URL, and then back in here, I'm saying regarding 3, please make sure to use the topic page API, topic page, and load topic page from ER. See example here. And then I'm just giving this URL. So I find that this works pretty well. It's actually able to retrieve web pages. It'll also do its own searches if needed, but this tends to be more reliable. Now, before I hit enter, let's look through the rest here, make sure that this all still makes sense. So key mapping, this all looks good as far as I can tell. URI, and this is a constant, that's correct. There's the URL, the source, the title, the body, published at, that all looks good. Then wiring up the command line interface, getting a session, creating a run, that makes sense. And then we're running fetch step.run. And then afterwards updating the run to complete it and printing a summary. That looks good. There are no steps here, so it's respecting the testing philosophy that we spelled out in the ClaudeMD file, because this logic, this is really just an API call, and we can really only test that the API does what the API says it does. We could be doing a whole bunch of mocking here and things like that. In reality, that adds negligible value for us. So there isn't really anything deterministic here, so it'll skip that. And then for verification, run it, and then run the pipeline. And it also respected what I said in Claude.md, that I generally prefer to do this manually, because a lot of the pipeline steps will incur actual costs from API calls and things like that. So I've told it that I usually want to do this myself. So it's nice to see that it respects all of that, except for this one tweak here. So let's hit enter. There we go. So now it's asking for permission to fetch this web URL. I'm going to allow all GitHub. Okay, so it's updated the plan. Let's see if it figured it out. Pipeline steps. Yeah, this looks like the right API. So it's creating the topic page and then calling topic.load topic page from ER and then get articles. Perfect. So this looks good. I will say yes and auto accept. You also see how it helps to use the plan mode rather than immediately proceeding to implementation. Now, chances are it would have discovered this if it had tried to implement it, and then it wouldn't have actually worked, or at least not in the way that we want it. So it might have discovered the error itself, or it might have just returned the wrong thing, and we would have had to point it in the right direction. But this is where plan mode is helpful. Okay, that was actually pretty quick. So let's see what it says. All 10 tests pass. It added the pipeline step, ABC for abstract base class, the fetch step using the topic page API, persists using the article repository, and updated the command line interface. To test end-to-end, it's reminding us to make sure that our env file has the 2 keys, which they already do. And then it reminds us how to run this. So this looks good. Let me take a quick look at the files. So here we just have the new event registry SDK dependency. Then let's look at the base step. So this is our abstract pipeline step. So these methods are just abstract. The concrete subclasses will implement these. So this is for loading inputs, doing all the processing, persisting to database, printing stats, and run basically just calls these in sequence. So that looks good. And then steps.py has our concrete step implementation, the fetch step. So let's take a quick look. Load inputs just returns none. Makes sense. In this case, there's nothing to load. And then process. This looks good. So we're reading the API key from the settings, then creating the topic page, loading the topic page. So this is where it makes the actual API call to the news API. Then we're getting the articles. We're getting page 1. Then for each article, we're just going to be creating an article object and mapping the fields appropriately, appending it to this list of articles, and then returning that. That looks correct as well, with one caveat that I'll get to in a second. And then in persist, we'll just use the article repository to persist all the articles that we have. So that's nice and clean. And then we're printing some stats just so we can see how many articles we've retrieved and how many of them were new. So that looks perfect. One caveat here, and that's fine, we'll actually come back to fix this, is it's only iterating over a single page of results. So we'll get 100 results here. It should be 100. And that's fine for testing things out. We're going to do a follow-up prompt to ask it to page through a couple of pages so we can get a more complete result set.